All right, guys, so I'm going to try and keep this brief. I'm not known for keeping things brief, so please bear with me if I waffle. I've been doing a lot of work with trying to standardize the way I work with bricks. I was doing a bit of work in Figma and using components and variable components and things like that. And I wanted to work out how can I map this as one-to-one to bricks so that if I do things in Figma, very easy for me to transfer that same model, design, thinking, whatever, straight into my page builder. And the very first thing that come to mind where a lot of guys like Kevin Gary, etc., are really highlighting is the block element modifier class naming model. And because Bricks has a class management system, it makes it very easy and very possible with Bricks. So I wanted to look at how I would do that. Now, a few things I wanted and that I didn't want. I don't want any external framework dependencies. So anything I do should be my own code. Or if I give this to somebody, it should be code that they can use without having to go and get an external framework that they're relying on. Things like Tailwind or things like that. Now, I don't want any external framework dependencies. No third-party plugins. I don't want to need or rely on someone else's code that may or may not be around in a year's time or may cause issues that I can't control. I want it to be easy to manage and follow the BEM and utility methodology. And as much as possible, I want the utilities, the BEM classes to be created and managed in the Bricks UI, not an external utility, program, code manager, whatever. So I want a basic framework that I can use for some CSS variables and some CSS utilities. Now that would basically be for font sizes and spacing, gaps, things like that. So I can create a SASS file, change a couple of variables, and I've got a different set of values depending on what variables I set, and the rest of it is done in Bricks. That's pretty much what I want. It's got to be scalable and easy to understand. Now, a couple of limitations, and this is definitely not a criticism because I know the guys at Bricks are working hard on doing what people ask for. I'm going to really push this for Thomas and his team to add some stuff that I'm going to talk about here, which allows you to manage your classes a bit better because it's a brilliant system, but there's a couple of lacking things that I wish it had, and I'm hoping this will highlight that so that they can look at adding these features. So the first thing, the limitation that it doesn't have is the global class manager. So that's my limitation. And the other one is there's no native way to highlight your class types. And what I mean by that is class type is being with these frameworks like BEM, I want to easily tell whether it's a block, element, or modifier, or a utility. And I've come up with a way to do this. Now, this is, for me, an interim thing. I'm really hoping this inspires the Bricks team to actually do something better. I'm not a super duper developer. I spend a day learning how to use Vue.js, and I've never used Tailwind before. Vue.js and Tailwind to create a little utility. So if I can do that in a day, surely these talented developers could do it as well in a short space of time and way better than what I've done. Anyway, I'm going to move this notepad out of the way and show you what I'm talking about. So this is the utility I've created. I'm going to go through how this works in the actual builder and why I've done this. But my utility basically lists out all of the global classes that are defined in Bricks in a list here. I've got some naming conventions so that what it's doing is that if the class starts with a FU dash, I'm going to call that a framework utility. So in my framework, my SASS framework, any utility that I want to define as being external, I just put an FU dash in the front of it. When I create utilities in Bricks, so utility classes that is, I'm going to use the BU dash as the Bricks utility, and that's going to identify that class as a Bricks utility. Now, if this was implemented through the Bricks UI properly, I would probably say they would have some options in the settings so you can actually set the prefixes for the classes that you want to be called utilities. or framework utilities or blocks, elements, modifiers. So you'd actually set the prefixes for those so that you can work the way you want to work with your naming. In my case, FU is framework utility, BU is a bricks utility. Any element that doesn't have an FU or BU and it doesn't have the 2 underscores or the 2 dashes is a BEM block. So if it only has the single dash separator or no separator at all, it is a block. So that's my default. If the class name has these 2 underscores in it, it is, actually I might just zoom in a little bit here so you can see what I'm doing. 2 underscores in it, it is an element. If it has the 2 dashes, it is a modifier. Okay, so if I look at my list down here, at the very top, I've got a section -- pad for header. I'll put this on my sections where I want to allow for my overlay or transparent header, and that will give me some extra padding at the top. Now, because it's got the 2 dashes, it is a modifier. My framework utilities, FU grid column 2, so it's going to convert instead of being a standard flex or div, it's going to convert it into a grid with 2 columns. I've got a bunch here. I'm not going to go through every one of these. My typical stuff, my text from XS, extra small, through to 3XL. Text responsive, so these using clamp to go from my XS size to S, right through to my XXL to XXL. So it uses clamp, and I'll show you that a little bit later. And my typical stuff that you'd see in a framework, margin 0, margin top 0, margin right 0, etc. Padding 0, padding top, padding right. And then I've got auto, what else have I got here? And then I've got my sizes. So my margin XS, margin top XS, all the way through to my XXL, and then my responsive sizes. I've then got some bricks utilities I've created. So inside the bricks UI, I've created a class here called BU border light, through to this BU text bold. Then I've got my BEM stuff here. I'll skip over these because these don't have very much there to talk about. So I'm just going to skip over some of these where I've got some more modifiers. Where are we here? Here we go. This one's all it. So I've got a service block basic as a BEM block. I've got a service block basic __ header. So that's an element. And then I've got a service block basic __ header -- center. So that's a modifier on that element. So it's very easy for me to look at this and go, okay, so my blue ones are for my framework. My orange ones are from a bricks utility. My grey with the yellow text is a B for a block. My blues here are probably should change that. I want 2 blues, are for my elements, and my greens are for my modifiers. So I can look at these classes straight away and I can see what they are. Now I haven't done this in the editor. I haven't worked that out yet, whether we can do that. I'd love it if I don't have to. I'd love it if Bricks would do something like this in the editor. So let's hope they do something like that. So this is all sortable. So let's go to Bricks. I'm going to edit this with Bricks. And what I'm going to do is just select a section so I can create some classes. I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to call it BU test utility. Test util. So I'm going to create a BU test util. Okay, and then I'm going to just get rid of that. I'm going to create just a test util. Okay, and I'm going to hit the save button so that it updates the back end. Come back to my, where is it there? I reload these, and what I'll see down the bottom is the 2 classes I've added. So because I've got a BU in front of that, it's orange. Because I don't have anything in front of it, it considers that as a block. All right. Now, if I want this util to be up with the others, now this is a little bit clunky. Drag and drop, got to go all the way up until I get to my blocks. And there you go. I can drag and drop that and stick it there and hit my save changes. And now if I go back to my builder, refresh, back to the section, test util, take that off so I can see where it is. And I'll see where my utilities are. Where's my bricks utilities? There you go. Scrolling too quickly. So I can see my test util is now in order because I've rearranged it through here. All right, so I don't want that, so I'm going to get rid of it because that was just a rubbish. Delete that, and down the very bottom I've got my block one that I created, so I'm going to delete that. All right, so I'm back to where I started. Now, I wish there was a way to do this where we could highlight in the editor. We could use some sort of color coding like this and some sort of indicator to say what it is. How cool would that be if you could just look in here, you could see what are these are modifiers, what are these are blocks, which are elements and which are utilities. How cool would that be? Or if you could just drag and drop and organize these in the order. Now, the organizing in the order it does two things. One is that just if you're looking in here, I know you've got some autocomplete where you can start typing and find things here anyway, but when you're talking about BEM, here's one thing I discovered. Well, should have known exactly. So for example, I've got a decoration line that's actually down here. I've got some lines, so I've got some underlines and overlines. So they're all decoration lines, and those decoration lines have some CSS to set the display to flex, the direction to column, and then what we can do is use for the underlines, the line top, we use the before pseudo selector, and for the line bottom, we use the after pseudo selector. So, and then we've got some things here for modifier, for thick, width, center. Now, here's where it gets really interesting with CSS, and this is a really obvious thing when you hear it. So let's say on this decoration line, which I without any other modifiers, it's this first one here, which is a 2 pixel high, and it's 100% of the width, right? So if I set that to 100% of the width on this class here, the decoration line, and then I've got one down here, which is a modifier, which sets the width to 50%, that will work because with the CSS rules, the way they're written out, this decoration line with 50 will get printed after the decoration line. So the order matters because the precedence is the same. So if I messed something up and I maybe deleted this direct decoration line and I recreated it in bricks, it would stick it to the bottom of my list, which now means my decoration line would get printed after my modifiers. So anything I put on my decoration line that I then change on my modifier won't work anymore because it'll apply the modifier and then it'll apply the block or the element. So the order matters, and it's only because with BEM, my understanding of it is that the modifiers have the variations, right? And the reason for that, let's say for example I've got a decoration line that sets the display to flex and the direction to column, right? If I want a underline here, I've got to add my decoration line and I've got to tell it's the bottom, and I've got a modifier here to tell it that I want it to be after. I want a minus 2.2 rem to bring the line up underneath the descenders. So I need to add both of these. Now the first class, the decoration line, has the flex properties. The decoration line bottom sets the after pseudo selector, sets the color, sets the width, all that sort of stuff. Okay, so we need both. So the modifier should only have the differences between the core and what you want modified. Otherwise, what happens, like I had a conversation with someone the other day and they've gone, well, why do you need both? Why can't you just put decoration line dash dash bottom and that puts one at the bottom? The reason for that is because if you do that, if you've got line bottom, line top, line left, line right, whatever, you then need to put all of the properties that you have on this decoration line on every one of these modifiers. And let's say you decide you want to change something in there. Let's say you want to put some padding on all the decoration lines, or you want to put some negative margin or whatever you want to put on there. You've got to go to every modifier and you've got to make that same change on every modifier. So it doesn't make sense. What makes more sense is to put all of your properties that you want on all of the variations on your core block or element, and then only the variations on your modifiers. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's really why it's important that the order of these is right. Okay, so that's why it's got to be really important to reorder, and that's why I've created this utility. I'll make it available to you guys just as a plugin, and this is a temporary thing until Bricks actually do something like this in the builder. So I'm not going to do any more with this. Just use it as it is. All right. So BEM. There's a lot of stuff out there on the internet. Kevin Gary does has some great videos about this on YouTube, but it makes complete sense. So before I get to BEM, let's look at our utility. So I've got my text responsive XS here. Actually, let's look at what it actually looks like. On the page. So these are just utility classes that I've got on here from my framework and on these texts here. So if I go look at that and go with F12 and I look at my responsive. So if you look at the topography on the left, it's using clamp. So it's actually changing size, in this case between XL and XXL size. It's changing size depending on the viewport. So it gets to XXL, that's its maximum size, and when we reduce the viewport, it gets down to XL, which is its smaller size. Now this really works nicely when you've got things like these arrows and you want your text to grow or shrink a little bit depending on the size of your screen, just to give you a little bit more space. So you end up with little text on the side on a big screen. So that's the point of this. All right, so looking in the builder, so all I do with a text box is add a heading, and then I set my size of the heading with a modifier, and I'm just going to make this the same. So if I put responsive, say text responsive, I've got my framework utilities, text responsive, and let's make this one M to L. And now that's got my medium to large responsive font size with clamp. If I want that a fixed size, then I'll put in text dash XL, and now it's an XL size, just like this one down here, as a fixed size. So that's a utility, a framework utility. Now you could also use this. Let's say, for example, you've created a block. I'm going to delete that and go down here, and I've got a block here, which is a BEM block. So I'll scroll in a little bit more so you can see it. So it is a content section block with a heading element. Okay. So on that, if I select that heading, and I look at my, select the class, so you've got to select the classes so they're orange, so you're editing the class, not the element. Look at my style, my attributes I've got is just a role on there. I don't think I've set any attributes on this yet. I haven't. So what I can do is set my size on this using my style attribute, typography. I'm going to look at my list of classes here. And I've got, and I'll show you through this a little bit later, where are we? Text. So text size, what do I want this to be? I want it to be my text responsive from medium to large. I'm going to grab that variable. I'm going to come over to here and I'm going to chuck that in my font size as a variable. Okay. Now this text here, it's not working. Why isn't that working? Okay, guys, I just had to stop the recording for a second and figure out what I'd done wrong. And this is a common issue that you're going to come across where sometimes you forget to highlight the class and you set properties on the actual element. So I take the highlighting off the class. I actually had a variable set on the element itself, or the DOM element itself. So that's why it wasn't working. So if I come into the DOM element and I take that off, go into my style for my actual heading and set that, I should now have this working. So there we go, our heading just got bigger. And if I change my viewport width, the heading is changing. And the reason is because on the heading element, I've put this responsive medium to large variable on there. So that's a little trap that you get used to. It takes a little bit of time, but quite often, for example, you might click on this header here, and you see the header selection is selected. If I go to this button, it's not selected. If I go to the footer, it's not selected, but if I click on that class, it's now selected. So now I'm actually changing the properties of that class. So what I'm going to show you here is where I use the BEM framework. And I'm going to skip over these because these are exactly the same as the one with the image, except for I've put an extra element in the image. Now I'm going to start with these. So if I go to this image here, what I have here is and it's just some naming I'll put in here. When I'm naming my DOM elements in the structure here, I've just put this B colon for a block, E for image, in the short term until we get some proper class highlighting in bricks. So that's a service block. So if I look at zooming in here, if I look at my classes here, I've got my service block basic is my block. Right? And in my layout, what have I got in my layout? All I've done is set the overflow to hidden, and that's just so when I have a border radius on here, the image doesn't poke out from the top of that image. So that's the only thing I've set on the block. Okay. From what I can see, no, I've set a background as well of a color of white. All right, so that gives my blocks a background color of white. So if I decided I want all my blocks to be, say, my accent color, all right, they've all changed there, but they've also changed up here as well because they're using the same element. Okay, so here's the power of BEM. Now, let's go back to this block here, and I'll go to my image. So you can see here, that's an underscore image, so that is a service block basic image element. And on my image, in my layouts, I've got it set to 100%. And in my content, I've got it set to cover. And in my CSS, I think, or CSS I should say, in my CSS, I've created a rule on root to set the aspect ratio. I couldn't find a property for this in bricks, so that's why I've set it here. And that just makes sure, regardless of the ratio of that image that we upload, they're all going to be exactly the same height, and the background is going to scale. The image is going to scale like it does with a CSS background. That's pretty much all I've done with that. So my header, if I go to my service block header, I can see from these green dots here, I've got some layout stuff offset. So here we go. So in the header, for this block, I've set my spacing in the padding to use one of my framework utilities, spacing small. So if we go to my utilities here, I've got my framework spacing XS through to XXL and spacing responsive all the way through to XXL as well. So that is the variables that I can use in here. Now I'll show you what I mean by here. So if we watch these blocks here, so we've got the headers in these blocks here, we've got the headers in these blocks here. If I change link those, I'm going to change that to medium. See, they've all got bigger spacing now. And they've all got bigger spacing up here as well because they're all linked. Go back to small, they've all got small spacing because they're all linked. Now, if I didn't select the class here, and I put a utility class, for example, on this one here, let's say we want some padding medium. So I'm going to go PM. So I'm going to padding medium. Work. Okay, so it looks like if we set the padding on the actual class, that's probably loading after my framework utility. So it's overriding this here, so that's not going to work if I set my padding on the actual element, so on the element class. So I could, though, go in and override it by going into the actual element. So I don't want to look at that. I want to look at the layout, and I want to set my padding on this one to be padding spacing medium. Actually use the large, that's more obvious. We grab the variable, come back here, and I set my padding on there. Okay, so now on this one element, I've got a large padding. On all the others, it's the same. They're the small padding. So because I'm setting this on that element property, it will override, but I can't add the utility class for padding because the header element's padding is going to override that. So let's get rid of this here, so we're back to normal. By the way, actually, I don't know if you know this, but you see the little green, sorry, the little yellow dots, that means there's a setting. You can actually just click on the X on that and that gets rid of it anyway. All right, so that's our service block. Then we've got down here a body, and on the body, at the moment, I've got some padding left, small padding right, small. Let's get rid of those because I think I've got those on the actual service block. Let's have a look here. My layout. Yes, I have. I've got the spacing small on the sides here, so I don't need those utility classes. So there's a bit of residual stuff from when I was mucking around previously. I've got a footer elements, so underscore elements, and on that I think I've just set the flex to horizontal row. My gap, I've got a gap in there. I probably should have a gap, so in case I have more than one button. So let's do a gap. They're at the top here, I think. Gap responsive. I'm just going to maybe just use my gap responsive for now. I could always add some extra variables for that. So let's put there my var gap responsive. Okay, that's going to put a 20 pixel gap on that, and which reduces at different sizes. Okay, so that's the first block. If we look at this block here, see how on my heading here, it's aligned to the left, and on the heading here, it's aligned in the center. So if we look at this header here, we'll see that I've got a class here, which is the header element with a modifier for center. So on my center, what have I done? It's a horizontal row, align the main axis to the center. So that's my override there. That's all I need. Now, it'd be the same for the footer. If I go to the footer center, it's just aligning the main axis to the middle. Now with my text box, which is the body, I've got a body aligned center. It's not flex that I'm aligning, it's the text. I go to my style and my typography. I'm telling it to align the text to the center. So that's the power of BEM. So my block at the top, service block here at the top, my elements like the image elements, my header elements, and I've also got some modifiers on that, in this case to center it. Right. Now, the other thing I was going to say with this here, the footer elements. So I'll show you something else I put in. So on the service blocks, I've set them to flex with a direction of column. And the reason I've done that is so that I can align these buttons to the bottom, sorry, the footers to the bottom, which contain the buttons. If we look at the basic footer, and I have a look at my layout, you can see I've got my margin. There's my framework utility spacing auto. So my margin is going to be auto. In fact, you can see that if you just roll your mouse over this. So my spacing auto. So what that's doing is saying my margin for this is auto with flex. That just pushes it to the bottom. Okay, so that's a very simple way of aligning your text to the bottom regarding what you put into here, for example. All right, so that's the BEM working for us there. So as a fair bit to go through, I'll talk about one more thing, which is you'll see on these service blocks here, I have a drop shadow, I've got a border radius, and when I roll my mouse over, the whole box moves up to the left, and I've got a increase in the box shadow to make it look like it's standing off. I decided to do those as utilities, not as on the actual service block, because I might want different service blocks having different effects on them. So the way I did this is I created a box shadow. So actually, border round, sorry. So I just add the border round utility to that block, which applies to this element. And the border round utility is basically setting my border to 8 pixels. If I set that to 40, it's going to change it. 40 pixels here, 40 pixels there. Everywhere else I've used that utility, it's going to change. Okay, so if I look at my my box shadow small, so again I've got BU, starting with BU, which means I created this in bricks. Right? Now with my box shadow small, it's basically a small box shadow with no offset, blur of 10, and a transparency on a black. So if I wanted this to be a darker box shadow, I can move my transparency up to here. Now we've got this ugly dark block shadow everywhere that we've used that utility. So drop that back down to what's reasonable. We just want a barely noticeable shadow. Right, so that's the box shadow small. Now the box shadow move utility. All right, we've got some CSS on that, which is basically setting our speed. So this is the non-hover state. This is when it's returning back to its default state. So I want to transition all with a variable of my framework utility duration fast with an ease in. So ease into the animation when I hover out. Okay. Here's the next cool thing in Bricks. So if I go to my pseudo classes up here and select my hover, now what I'm doing is setting my duration to normal and ease out. So I'm actually changing the hover state of box shadow move. So the other thing I'm doing is setting my box shadow to be bigger. There's an offset on it, and my transform here, I'm telling it to move 5 pixels to the left, 5 pixels up. And that one utility gives me that movement to the top left with a greater box shadow. So anywhere I want to use this, I can basically add an element. In fact, let's say we'll pick one of these here. So I've got this marker here. If I want to add that to a box shadow, then I'll add my box shadow. Oops, not in my pseudo selector. In my styles. Here's my box shadow small. Okay, now I've got a small box shadow in there. You can hardly notice it on the screen. Now if I add my box shadow move, there we go, roll my mouse over, and this marker's moving, and that movement, that box shadow movement is going to be exactly the same as every one of these, keeping it consistent. So that's the power of using the utilities to add your borders, animations, box shadows, all that sort of stuff. It's a single setting that applies wherever you use it. Cool, isn't it? That is so cool to keep it consistent. So I think what I've done here is I've achieved these things here. So no external framework. No third-party plugins apart from the one that I'm using to organize and manage the BEM. It's using the BEM methodology. All of the settings, the colors, the styles, the shadows, everything I do is in the Bricks UI, not in an external code manager. It's very scalable, easy to understand because we're using the same methodology for every single element that we use. So I think that's achieving these, and I think that that's something that I'm going to continue to work on. Now, quickly, lastly, my code block. So I've got this made up of SASS. Just scroll back out of there a little bit. So I've got a utility, which is basically giving me my utilities for grids, utilities for gaps, utility for my section, my default section to give me my padding at the top and the bottom. If I add section for pad for header modifier, I'm going to allow some additional padding for my overlay header, my text sizes, my responsive text sizes using clamp, all my different sizes with paddings, margins, top, bottom, left, right, all sides, are all done using this here. Going back a step, I've got my SCSS variables, which is the only thing I need to change all of this. So basically, what am I setting my REM sizes for my different size types here? Where am I calculating my midpoint for my clamp for your font sizes, my breakpoints, for the responsive spacing on mobiles, what I want to divide these by, 2.5 in this case, on responsive on tablet divided by 1.5, default gap, what do I want my default gap variable to be, which we're going to, default animation speeds, my actual header heights, and all I should need to do is if I want to change any of the sizing on this, I come back to these variables, I change these, hit the save button, update, and my framework has updated with all the new calculations. And that ends up giving me new CSS variables. So all these CSS variables are calculated based on those SASS variables in here. And then the file that actually gets output, which is my utilities, references those CSS variables that I created from my SASS. So that's my framework. I end up with very, very simple framework where all I've got is some base sizes, some base gaps, some base durations, text sizes, spacing, responsive spacing. I've then got some utilities for my grids. I've got all the different sizing here for the different sides, so I can use this for margins and paddings. And that's everything that's in my utility classes. There's no flex, there's no colors, there's no borders or anything like that you get with Tailwind, because you don't need it. You can do that all directly here within Bricks by creating utilities and using the UI to manage those utilities, not having to recompile Tailwind, etc. So this, I think, works for me. I'd love to get some feedback as to whether you think this is a good way to go, whether you think I'm missing the point, whether there's better ways to do this. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from the experts as to whether I'm on the completely wrong track or whether this makes sense. So thanks for listening, and sorry it was so long. A lot to cover. Thank you.